We never said that.
I don't think anyone's stealing. I never even said, hey.
It was a simple.
This is missing.
Can we just have the accounting?
At this point?
Yeah, we just wanted the accounting. And I from what I remember in 2019 when we finally got it, there was a quote unquote $400 and something thousand mistake.
So
I don't know what accountant makes a $400,000 mistake.
So,
but okay, everybody, nobody's perfect. So I'm putting that out there. But it was just a little weird to me.
I find something immediately. Mm-hmm. And I don't get disrespectful because I understand people make mistakes, and nor do I think people are stealing. That's my man. I love him. I don't think he's stealing from me.
Right.
This is some shit we doing, and I know Joe got a lot of other shit going on. I got a lot of other shit going on. You got a lot of other shit going on.
Mm-hmm.
People make mistakes.
Right.
And by the way, nor do I think Joe did the accounting. Right. The people that was hired to do it did it.
But now, that is bigger money coming in and all that, shit just got weird, bro. Like, shit just got very weird for me, and I'm not good with doing weird shit. I don't do weird shit. I don't like weird energy from niggas. Like, I remove once I see niggas doing weird, funny shit, I just get away from that. Like, I don't even want to be around that type of shit. And now it's to a point where you saying things and, you got other niggas in the room saying things and chiming in, and I'm like, yo, what's up with y'all niggas? Like, what the fuck is going on? So now I'm sitting here now everything is starting to become really clear to me. Like, shit is starting to really become clear to me, like, oh, you niggas been having little conversations and conspiring shit for a minute. You niggas been trying to, like, set shit, playing shit with the chess piece and try to set shit up to look a certain way for a while now, because now that the shit is out the bag, I'm starting to see everybody's true feelings on certain things. And people is talking about business that they don't know nothing about. They talking about contracts that they don't know nothing about. And I'm just like, fam, what the fuck is going on here, man?
All right, we're in the end of the Haize segment. And so, as I said at the opening, we'll be talking about this Joe Budden situation. This is like one of the most interesting things going on right now in the creative space. Only because this is so anything that I say here, I want to make sure that I set the foundation that this in no way stops Joe from being a genius in what he was able to do and what they were able to build with that podcast. The fact of we always said, if you listen to the Breaks Radio, and even back when Johnny and Ralph were on the Breaks Radio, we always talked about Joe's rebrand from going from a rapper to a creative and to a content creator specifically has been amazing. It's been huge. It's something that I think we all in that creative space, whether you agree with Joe or not, you look up to it in a way, because what he was able to do with getting an exclusive Spotify deal at the time where exclusive deals of that magnitude were very rare. Now that you see them being more common, I think Joe Rogan has one and a couple other podcasts have one. That was monumental, right? He broke ground with that podcast, and especially being one of the first ones from this culture, that was able to do that. Really, first ever. Like I said, I may be wrong if it's another podcast I don't listen to or whatever, but at least the Joe Budden Podcast was one of the first ones that I can remember getting that exclusive deal. When that was announced, that was huge. And so, don't want to take away from that. But the thing that I want to talk about, so they came out with an episode of the Joe Budden Podcast, which was then taken out and then I think posted on Patreon, which is another smart business move. Like I said, you can't take away from Joe Budden's business acumen. You can't take away from that. And when that episode got released, I think they said it was up for an hour, and then of course, as we know, if it's on the internet, it's going to live forever. And that's probably why it did end up getting posted to Patreon. But, we started getting the clips and then full episodes and everything. And in this, he went on quite a rant. And I'm going to play the clip. I know everyone's probably heard it at this point, but just so it's not me paraphrasing and you actually get to hear Joe Budden, from Joe Budden's mouth, let's go ahead and get into that.
Change the splits. Change the benchmarks. Hey, y'all go get a deal and bring it back. I'll take less. I'll take less. Not much less. Not much less. But I'll take less if y'all source it. Hey, y'all go get the advertiser and the integration. Hey, we talk about these deals all the time. You bring it, you eat different. I bring it, I eat different. You niggas ain't brought shit. Ain't got the nerve to have y'all fucking representation and ain't been around in 6 years. Hit Ian phone about something. I won't say what I want to say. But y'all will not continue to treat me this way. Y'all not gonna continue to treat these people this way. Y'all take that fucking dark energy, that arrogance, and that entitlement somewhere else.
PTSD.
I say all of that to say, we gonna do this. Since Rory feels like he has so many options here. Somehow he still feels like he's running the show. He still feels like he has choices and options. He feels like he's entitled to more. Rory, you are in breach of your contract, and from this point forward, you are fired, and you're not welcome back. Does anybody in here have a problem that I'm the person that has to say that?
No.
Mal, I'm the person that has to say that. The gall of you to think that you are observing the way that I am.
And so, Joe is clearly upset. Like, regardless of whose side you believe or not, we'll get into Rory and Mal and them coming out with the episode 2. Regardless of whose side you're on, it's clear that Joe was upset. He was frustrated, and he wanted to prove a point. Now, like I said, I'm going to try to not get into like picking sides. I'm just going to stick to the facts of this. But like, when you talk about, when you get to the point of like having to air out the dirty laundry, and then I'm not going to play every clip, but like him bringing up how Mal used to live with him. And like, once you start getting personal, like on that level, that's when, to me, it feels like these are more so feelings that have been bubbling for a while, more than just the business, right? This is personal stuff going in there, because in my mind, and as someone who's even worked with creators and had co-hosts that didn't do as much of the work that I did. And that's not a shot. That's the truth. But when it came to me, I took on the majority of that because I asked for them to join the podcast. So I didn't have an expectation of the work being equal. But it can get frustrating at times. And so I don't know if that's some of the frustration coming out now. Like I said, we'll get into Rory and Mal's perspective in their side of the story. But Joe wanted to paint this picture like of it seemed like tearing them down, like on a personal level first, and then linking that back into the business of basically making it seem like they're not smart businessmen. And the thing that is kind of odd to me in this, Joe has been someone that's very voicious in this creative community of knowing your contracts, knowing things that are going into the business. So if you didn't instill that or make sure and be transparent in that with your boys, like your friends, not just your business partners, but people who were friends to you. And him saying that like nobody ever was checking for Rory. And so this is where we'll get into like the back and forth, right? So Rory and Mal came out with an episode, again, another smart business plan from them. They came out with it on Vimeo, charged $2 for it, but that $2 was going to go far because everyone wanted to hear their side of the story. And so they, on the flip side of Joe Budden, seemed very calm, focused on the business, focused on the facts of it, didn't tear down Joe as a person very often. Now, they did go into some of the things with Joe, but it didn't get as personal, I feel like, on the Joe Budden side. Again, not really taking sides on it. And ultimately, when you have a profit sharing plan, you have to know the ins and outs. They said it. And in asking that, it shouldn't have been any problems. When it starts seeming like frustration comes out, and this is for anyone, this is outside of the Joe Budden. If you're in a business deal with somebody, and when you start asking questions, if it starts seeming like tension comes from questions being asked, not accusations being thrown, but just questions about the business, where it's being held, the numbers, whatever else. I more so talk about analytics, but knowing your numbers, not just the download numbers, but knowing the actual analytics, the ins and outs. If it gets to a point to where you're asking that and tension comes from that, that would raise a red flag. That should raise a red flag for anyone, in my opinion. And so this came off when Rory and Mal came out with their side of it. It really came like they had questions about the way that business was ran. Now, where I said before that some of the things that seeming now that we have all this, like Joe has always been somebody who admittedly self-destruct situations. He's very self-destructive. Hell, I think one of his whole albums was talking about his tendency to be self-destructive. And so when you have somebody who is admittedly with that, and when you look at, like, for anyone who's actually followed his rap career, you know, at one point he was Def Jam's golden child. Like, Def Jam thought that they were going to have the next huge artist that they were going to ride out for the next 10 years that was going to be big for them when they got Joe Budden. That relationship soured, I think, by the time of his second album because of Joe, and maybe it was even before then, but because of Joe's hot-headedness, because of Joe Budden, like I said, I want to make sure that I say this because I am a fan of Joe Budden, is a creative genius, but sometimes with that geniusness comes problems. Joe is very narcissistic. When you look at, like, Joe's history, outside of, like, music career, his relationships, every almost partnership that he has had some tension because of Joe's self-destructive nature. People in the Slaughterhouse have talked about it. They make sure that they still say that he's their brother. Royce the 5'9" has been very boisterous on, like, how sometimes he's the, like, he had to bump heads with Joe to get Joe to realize certain things. So this is something, and this is the problem where when somebody comes out with an initial story, and because of their fandom to that, they take that as truth and run with it. Now, when Mal and Rory came out with their podcast and their side of the story, it started filling in some of those holes that Joe Budden, it seemed like he wanted to talk around things. That's my personal opinion. It may not be yours. Now, the way that all, like, boiled down and end up turning out, like, it ultimately just sucks for the culture, right? We talk about ownership a lot on the Breaks Radio. Joe Budden's talked about ownership a lot, and, he said it was a good run, but then they released the episode, I think, like a day or two later, so it doesn't seem like the Joe Budden podcast is going to be stopping, and it shouldn't. Like, as long as Joe Budden's around and he wants to do it and he can find people to co-host with him, he should continue that podcast because at this point, like, that means something. But when we get into, like, Rory and Mal's portion of it and Joe's seemingly reluctantness to be transparent about the business, where that can hurt at, and this is what, even when Charlamagne kind of talked about it, it's funny that Joe has been someone that's been so open and saying know your deals and talked about business and everything, and now Joe Budden has this network. Now, as a creative, would that make you hesitant to partner with Joe Budden with these accusations and, things being out? What does that now do to the Joe Budden network? We know that, like, there are he's built that YouTube channel out and that network out with some dope creatives and dope show concepts and everything. But does that cause now people to start wondering and second guessing their business dealings with Joe Budden? Do we see a fall from that? I'm not calling that. I hope not. I hope, like, you would think that, that the creatives that work with them are smart enough, and a lot of them are already established with other shows, that they're smart enough to be on top of their deals, so that way they're protected regardless of how things go. But I think when you start seeing how this kind of fell out or works out, like Joe Budden's criticisms about the Black Podcast Network and the deal with iHeartRadio, Charlamagne, and Drink Champs, not all that, when that came out, it's like, but you didn't even have your boys back, right? And then, Mal told a story about Joe Budden and Joe, saying, look, I sold it out. Look at the line that I got. And you would, like, no, it's us. Like, regardless of, and there's this big conversation about, like, the name of the podcast being the Joe Budden Podcast. We understand why that is. But regardless, when you work with people, when you have co-hosts that show up every week like you show up, you can't just put that on them. And Mal made a great point. When Joe Budden's music career, he wasn't selling out those arenas. And I think we forget sometimes that what makes rappers so great is the arrogance. How I talked about that all creatives, I feel, have a touch of narcissism. Now, it's more out of control with some of us than others. But if what Mal and Rory said is taken as truth, and Joe felt that the success of the podcast was in part because of his music career, you can't deny that that's a part of it. He was part of one of the best and most respected rap groups in recent memory in Slaughterhouse, even if you don't know Joe Budden's solo career. So, like, yes, he came in with some form of a built-up audience. But you can't say that like, Joe Budden's album sales to what the podcast was able to do, even if 100% of the people who listened and were huge fan of Joe Budden's music supported the podcast, it still wouldn't amount to that type of success for that podcast. It has to be more than that. And Rory and Mal were a part of why that podcast was successful. The dynamic was part of the reason why that podcast was successful. Now, Joe has replaced them with people he also has personal relationships, so maybe that dynamic on the show continues to go forward. But what questions does that raise for people who want to work with Joe Budden going forward? And shout out to Tahoe, who is great for this culture. Tahoe TV, by the way. If you listen to me, I'm sure you guys listen to him. But in his video, he talked about, like, what does that mean for Joe going forward? And, I would hate to see the podcast fail or go down. I don't think that it's going anywhere. Like, if it's one of the, like, yeah, he may lose some listeners to this. But this is why I think for me too, like, and this is where I'll start making it introspective rather than just the Joe Budden. And I want to hear you guys' opinion on this, like, and stuff. But for me, this is why, like, the Awakened Soul has always been so important to me. For people who are like, why do you have so many other podcasts? Like, because I have my own outlet, because I have the Awakened Soul, which is just my podcast, it makes it easier for the Breaks Radio. It makes it easier for the Film Frequency. It makes it easier for my Brother's Keeper. Because if me and JB have any disagreements on something that we want to cover or how we do it, I'm more inclined to give him that. Like, unless I feel like it's going to hurt the show, fuck, if JB wanted to, like, yeah, we did a Bollywood movie. I knew nothing about Bollywood movies, but that's my brother. That's my guy. And because I have an outlet in the Awakened Soul that's just mine, if we disagree on something, if we bump heads on something, I have no problems going with, I trust JB wholeheartedly. So even if it's something that I think may not be successful, I'm going to trust him regardless. But if it came to something that I wanted to do versus something he wanted to do with the Film Frequency, 9.5 times out of 10, I'm going to be 100% fine going with whatever he wanted to do, because if he didn't want to cover a movie on the Film Frequency that I just wanted to talk about, I have this outlet of the Awakened Soul that I could talk about it. Same with my Brother's Keeper. Same with the Breaks Radio. The Breaks Radio, if you've noticed, over the last, like, year and a half, especially now that we've added Marquee as well, like, it's taken on its whole new shape. And that's not because of me. I can't take the recent success and growth of the Breaks Radio is 122% because of our dynamic. It's not because of me and my built-in audience that I brought. It's not because of Baylor and his built-in audience. It's not just because of Mary and the legitimacy she adds to the podcast by being somebody who worked at BET and Hot 97. It's not just because of Marquis and his amazing music mind. It's a culmination of all of that. And like I said, if there was, for a reason, something that I wanted to cover that they didn't, we gonna go with what they wanted to do. And you heard Joe Budden criticize Mal and Rory for not really creating their own separate podcast outside the Joe Budden podcast. And that really kind of seemed like well, if you got your own, you wouldn't be worried about what's going on, to me, again. But I hope that these guys now are going to be doing a consistent podcast, because Mal and Rory, they have a great dynamic, but Mal is funny as fuck. They do have a certain level of being knowledgeable about things in the culture. Their voices are needed, I think, in this community and in this culture. And, some people disagree with me on that, and that's fine. But I would hate to see people who have now learned what being a creative is to not have it. And ultimately, what I would say is that, we see it all the time. We see podcasts break up. We see people who had friendships for years, when they get into this creative space and try to create something together, it goes to shit. The friendship gets lost or whatever else. Hell, it's happened in me, just to be transparent. With me and AJ, like, but ultimately, I think that if you have your own on top of what you're doing, it makes the business side of a joint venture that much easier. And so that's just me speaking from my experience. But that's it. That's all we got for this week's In the Mind of Haize segment. I really just wanted to talk about it and work through it overall to myself and everything else. But ultimately, I think if for some reason the Joe Budden podcast stopped tomorrow, they don't release any more episodes, whatever, that run is one of the greatest runs in this podcast. And podcasting is still relatively in its infancy. Yes, it's been around for almost 20 years at this point. Probably more like 10 or 15. Yeah, probably more like, I'm fucking 35. So yeah, probably more like 10 or 15. But it's still developing, but they had one of the greatest runs of all time on that podcast. And, when you look at like Joe's relationships and why they fall out, let's not forget that the Joe Budden podcast started off with Marissa and Rosenberg, right? Was it Rosenberg? And that fell apart, right? And because of some of the same reasons. Joe had beef with one of the members. He fired Marissa when it didn't have anything to do with her. She's come out and of course, now people want to interview her and talk about it. Like, you can acknowledge somebody's greatness. You can still acknowledge that you've learned so much from somebody, while also taking accountability. Well, not accountability, but for taking into account their toxic nature to a degree. And I know the word toxic has been overused, but their negative sides as well. If we're going to step away from the word toxic, Joe self-destructs. And, we'll never know 100% of the story there, no matter how many versions, stories, episodes they come out with that. We will never know 100% of the story. But when you take all that into consideration, there's probably problems and faults on both sides. And very often, it's easy, right, when something falls apart, when something breaks apart, to only acknowledge the other person's part in the issue, right? That it's natural, right? It's natural because it's if you're talking and communicating an issue or a problem or a fallout, it's easier, and it probably comes to mind first to talk about the other person's part in it. But if you really are honest, you played a part in it as well. Now, maybe the part isn't as big. That can be determined throughout the story, but both sides always play a part in why something falls. And I hope that when people listen to this, it's not just taken as like a blindly Mal and Rory right or blindly Joe's right. The truth is that it's you take all the stories and information in, everybody probably had a fault, whether it's communication, whether they could have been more boisterous or been more stern on needing certain information rather than taking it and ride with it, which is something that, Rory and Mal admitted, especially Rory saying, he kind of just rode with stuff sometimes to keep Joe from flipping the fuck out. And that's never good either. You can't allow somebody's emotional state or inability to handle certain things to make you step back from information that you need. So keep that in mind as well. But that's it during this kind of lengthy In the Mind of Haize segment. We're going to go ahead. We're going to get into a break. On the other side of this break, you'll be hearing me and Rod. And we'll be talking about J. Cole's new album and career overall. I'll see you guys there.